So the Lynn W. Lectureship in Forest and Conservation History is a collaborative effort between the Forest History Society, Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, and Duke's History Department. Presenters are recognized scholars in environmental history or leaders in researchers in natural resources. These are all people who are shaping our understanding of human history and environmental change. Today's speaker is Curt Meine. Curt is a conservation biologist, environmental historian, and writer based in Sauk County, Wisconsin. He serves as a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation and the Center for Humans and Nature. He's a research associate with the International Crane Foundation and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Now, over the last 3 decades, Curt has worked with a wide array of organizations at the intersection of biodiversity conservation, agriculture, water, climate change, environmental justice, and community resilience. He has authored and edited several books, including the biography entitled Aldo Leopold, His Life and Work, first published in 1988 and then republished I'm not sure if it was updated, but republished in 2010. So point is, it's the definitive work and still in print. If he looks familiar to you, you may remember him as the on-screen host of the documentary film Green Fire about Aldo Leopold, which was released in 2011. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Curt.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And I trust you can hear me, and I trust that I'm moving on your screens wherever you are. And thank you so much for that great introduction. Thank you to Forest History Society and Duke for offering this invitation. It's a tremendous honor knowing some of the former speakers, many of them good old colleagues and friends. So I'm really grateful. Well, what an honor again. And I want to extend a last thank you, if I may. Here we go. There we go. A little nervous there with the technology, but also a special thanks to this group. My lecture today really has benefited from working with this group in the American Society for Environmental History on land conservation history and justice. Over the last year and a half or so, this group has gotten together, and I've shared this presentation in kind of a shortened form with them. And a special thanks to Matt Himmel and Michelle Steen-Adams for organizing this effort, which has been really enlightening and stimulating and encouraging during these times. So thank you to all the members, if any of you are tuning in, for your feedback on what I'm going to be sharing today. So just a quick word before I get into the content here too, is I'm speaking today from a couple perspectives as both a conservation practitioner and an environmental historian. And of course, that lens itself is not binary. History informs conservation, and conservation practices shape the questions we ask of history. So my aim basically today is to consider, hopefully in a constructive way, the basic public-private bifurcation that has shaped so fundamentally the way we practice and understand the history of land conservation. And I want to also offer a quick caveat right up front. By and large, this will be a modern North American perspective on this very large theme, and it was already too big to try to address a lot of other relevant issues and the larger historical and geographical realms. So with that, those caveats in mind, here's what I'm going to do in the next half an hour, 35 minutes. So start off with a few images of land tenure to fire our imaginations a little bit. Talk about the history in a kind of a sweeping, quick overview of the binary of public and private lands. Then I'm going to suggest an alternative frame for thinking about how we understand and consider land tenure from a historical perspective. And then at the end, just a little bit of a coda to the talk on how this binary has played out and evolved, especially in the last generation. So that's what I'll be doing. But let's start with those images of land tenure. And I've been using this background photo here. I'm speaking to you from Wisconsin. And I am a little concerned. My presentation might be a little too Badger-centric today, but I'll try to not fall into my my prejudices on Wisconsin too much. But I use this image in part as a way of acknowledging where I'm speaking from. This is a photo from northeastern Wisconsin. It's not a split screen, as you might think. It is not a border between public parkland or refuge land or private land. On the left of this is the forest of the Menominee Nation, Menominee Nation's reservation land, and the famed Menominee Forest. On the right is private farmland. And famously, this border and the block of solid canopy forest can be seen from outer space. It's a long story and another lecture about the Menominee Forest, but if you've ever heard of it or had a chance to visit, you know that this is a special place in Wisconsin, of course for the Menominee people, but also for all of the rest of us who care about land and its history. It was the largest block of forest spared the deforestation that brought down virtually all of the upper Great Lakes forest during the logging era of the late 1800s. And the nation has followed sustainable forestry practices there for generations and has become a global model for sustainable forestry. So that is another lecture. But with the image, I do want to state at the outset that this public-private binary that we often think about in terms of land tenure doesn't do justice to the history and evolving status of Native American and First Nations lands. So I'm actually speaking to you from my home in southwestern Wisconsin, from ancestral Ho-Chunk Nation territory. And I want to use the second photo here to stimulate us. This I took about 10 miles from where I sit on a large parcel of Ho-Chunk land that was formerly part of a military facility. And over the last 25 years, the nation has been working collaboratively with allies to, as it says in the sign here, heal the land and people. In 2014, it was able to reclaim these 1,500 acres, which in fact is the largest contiguous parcel the nation holds in its ancestral territory. That too is another lecture. In fact, I think I could do a lecture just on this sign alone. I'll just let it sit with you, but I will come back to it at the very end of the lecture. Here's a landscape feature that many of you will recognize and be familiar with, especially if you're in the Northwest. The checkerboard forests of the American West, a legacy of the 19th century railroad land grants, also by having a profound effect on Indian country. The checkerboarding of native lands is also a phenomenon out west that the tribes have to deal with. And it's also even in the news, in headlines lately. If you're from the Central Rockies, you probably have heard about the issues having to do with the juxtaposition of public and private lands in the checkerboard and trespassing. And if you're familiar with this issue, you are probably familiar with scenes like this, where to cross from one parcel of public land to the next, hunters and other recreationists will use ladders, for example, to avoid trespassing, and it's in the courts right now. So just a few more. Let's go to a few iconic landscapes in the history of the American conservation movement. The Adirondack Park and forest is a mixture of public and private land, almost half and half, 49 to 45%. So here we have one of the most important and early protected places on the continent, but it is part public and part private. Or we can go to the Yellowstone. On the boundaries of the Yellowstone here in the Gallatin Valley, you can see development coming up to the edge of the iconic Yellowstone Park boundary line. And here you see, and especially vivid in this image, the bright developed pieces of the greater Yellowstone landscape coming up to the boundaries of the large parcels of public land. On this one, I might say it's nice to see that list up top, to see the breakdown. We'll talk more about this, but public, private, tribal, and other federal lands as well. Here is a piece of land we don't think of as public land in the same sense, but it very much so is. Park, created in 1855. What we often don't realize is it displaced African Americans living in Seneca Village, as well as poor Irish and German. But this juxtaposition of the public land and the urban lands obviously brings up some of the same issues that we see in more remote, quote unquote, or less populated landscapes. And then finally, a headline from last week: the biggest election, wins and losses for America's public lands. And with this lecture in mind, I immediately, in reading this, found myself thinking, I've never read an equivalent headline assessing wins and losses for America's private lands, much less America's tribal or native indigenous lands, much less for the land as a whole. So the series of images might suggest other questions for you as they do for me. For example, how has our understanding of the public and private realms and their relationship shaped our stories of them? How have changing insights from ecology and other scientific fields over the last century forced us to rethink land conservation policy? How do issues of land history, property, identity, and justice intersect in this context? What does land conservation and caretaking of these places look like as we face uncertainty and epic changes? So again, I'll have a caveat here that we could follow this theme, and we should, back far deeper into American and world history to understand how the public domain came to be separated from the private domain historically. But I'm going to stick today to the emergence and development of conservation in the last 2 centuries. But again, with a bow toward indigenous knowledge and relationships outside that time frame. And in fact, that's a core point that I do want to return to toward the end of my presentation. So, pause to think of the broad, complex history of conservation, the intersection of ethics, scientific knowledge, policy, management practices. It might be simplifying, but I think we can boil it down to saying that advocates, practitioners, and policymakers have sought fitfully to conserve over the last 2 centuries the commons, common pool resources in the language of policy, by countering the forces and effects set in motion by colonization, land appropriation, fragmentation, privatization, settlement, commodification, industrialization. Historians have assessed this partially to some degrees. When we look at some of the classic works in environmental history, I think we could probably say there's been a bias toward public lands. I don't know quite how to measure it, but most of the classic works have tended to focus, I would say, sort of just assessing it without measurement, toward the public land dimensions of conservation and environment. Lots of scholarship, some of the most important works, foundational works in the field of environmental history. There is a quieter lineage of works that have looked beyond the public domain to the history of private land property, environmental impacts, agriculture, private land conservation. And in the last decade or so, more recent texts have expanded that narrative, exploring issues of race, class, and gender, bringing forward varied voices and stories, and helping to take the discussion about the history of land conservation to new places, literally and figuratively. So what I want to suggest is that we're at a new place and an inflection point in comprehending the history of land conservation, even as we are inventing and must invent new ways and means of caretaking our human and natural communities together. And what I want to do in the remainder of my talk is consider the history of land conservation with a view toward the stewardship, restoration, and resilience of whole landscapes, entailing mixed regimes of land tenure and efforts to integrate public and private interests and more. And in doing so, it remains essential to question what such interests are, who has belonged and now belongs within the community of interest, especially regarding historic appropriation of and exclusion from land. And in doing this, I'm going to make an assumption that efforts to conserve land while confronting historic inequity and addressing these legacies more effectively are constrained by the assumed strict dualism between private and public land, and by extension, private and public interest. So let's start first by reminding ourselves of the distribution of public and private lands across the nation here. Here's a good map of federal and state-controlled lands. A couple points I would like to make on this particular version of this. There are many versions of these kind of maps. Note that it does include reservation lands, tribal lands, apart from federal and state, but yet yet included here. I'd like to see on this map the levels and types of government-held lands, federal and state and county. But notice there are a few things that are probably missing. If you wanted to really get into the details, use your imagination. Prisons, or the interstate highway system, all kinds of other public lands and assets. It's here's another version of it showing the percentage of land. Of course, we all know the distinction between eastern and north and western United States according to the percentages of public land. Of course, this is core to the narrative that we're going to be exploring in the rest of the talk. So it's interesting to think, of course, you can find these maps online pretty easily. It's a little harder to find equivalent versions of private land, but they do exist, so you can kind of flip back and forth and see, again, the difference between eastern and western landscapes, and of course the Midwest with its highly productive agricultural soils and lands being dominantly privatized. And because of this particular talk, I thought I'd throw in forest ownership, forest land ownership. And again, you see a breakdown across the nation, different types of public and private and tribal lands included in this map. And for tribal lands, again, equivalent maps. This is a fascinating one in that it reflects the Oklahoma lands of the 5 civilized tribes, which are subject to several key court cases, including one in the Supreme Court right now and have been in recent years. But now let's go back to how this disposition of lands came to be, the creation of the public-private binary. In many ways, this is revisiting episodes from American History 101, and it's always good to have a refresher. I certainly enjoyed digging back into some what I thought I knew understanding of this history. So cursory and vastly oversimplified this next set of slides, but will get us to talking about the core of this. So how did we go from the dispossession of the native communities of the continent to this? How did we create private land? It started with the alienation of native lands. But of course, we can walk through a series, and I'll mention, of course, a few of the landmarks that we can remember from our early history courses, going all the way back to the Land Ordinance of 1785, which defined the foundations of federal land policy, provided the mechanism for surveying, selling, and settling land, established the public land survey system, and the mechanism also, we might add, for locating and funding public schools, the Section 16 school sections, as they're called, which are reserved as public land for schools. Shortly thereafter, the Northwest Ordinance took the process the next step, establishing the concepts of fee simple ownership in the country, ceding unsettled quote-unquote lands to the federal government and quote new lands that would be administered by the federal government, and territories out of those new lands administered directly by Congress. Of course, I'm going to have to skip over some key steps along the way here, including the Indian Removal Act, 1830, the Morrill Act, setting up the land-grant university systems, 1862. But our landscape across the continent really reflects, as you all know and have seen in your own places, the imposition of the land survey system. Here's the point of beginning on the shores of the Ohio River, from which the remainder of the continent was measured by mostly young men like these out on the survey lines. Here's the map of the continent. You see the point of origin there on the Pennsylvania-Ohio border, but a large portion of the United States, of course, carried out the land survey to convert what had been, quote, public land or the public domain to private property. In Wisconsin, it looked like this. Again, I'm speaking to you from, I can tell you, about 52 miles due north of this point, the point of beginning in Wisconsin. I walked out to the bit and found that marker at the base of that fence post, the point from which all of Wisconsin would be measured all the way up to Lake Superior, from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. The Homestead Act, of course, actually there was a series of Homestead Acts that provided the process for individuals to acquire ownership of land in the public domain, encouraging Western migration and settlement. 270 million acres of land eventually distributed, with the last claim being made in Alaska in 1986. The Dawes Act, infamously, of course, depriving Native Americans of lands on their reservations 100 years after those early federal land ordinances, and of course would convert traditional systems of land tenure in Native communities into the government-imposed system of private property. 90 million acres of Native American land would be taken out of Indian ownership and control before the act was effectively rescinded in 1934. So all of this that I've gone through is pre-conservation. The assumption was that, in fact, the public interest was being best served through the conversion of the public domain to private property and its distribution to private individual and corporate landowners. But trends and events were beginning to undermine that assumption and bring into question the propriety of privatizing all land everywhere in the manner that had been followed for a century. The second half of the 1800s brings about the great period of resource extraction, the era of overgrazing and market hunting, of hydraulic mining in California, wetland drainage, especially across the Midwest. But most significantly, perhaps, is the episode of epic deforestation of the upper Great Lakes forest, peaking in the 1880s and 90s here from Michael Williams' classic work on history of American forestry. The peak pine graph, as I sometimes call it, of white pine lumber production. And of course, the reaction to this epic period of resource extraction begins to bring conservation into the public consciousness, even though that word conservation has not yet acquired its modern meaning. So we can think of some of the key founding figures in our conservation history. George Perkins Marsh, 1864, his foundational book, Man and Nature, with a special emphasis that'll become important in the talk a bit here on the connections between watershed functioning and deforestation. Or John Wesley Powell, who proposed, of course, a radically different vision for the settlement and development of the public lands of the arid West through the U.S. Geological Survey, understanding that, in fact, the settlement patterns that had worked out east were not going to work out west in these arid lands. And so he proposed that we organize ourselves politically by watershed rather than arbitrary political boundaries. 1879. By the end of the century, the 1800s, we begin to see the earliest reserved lands, a radical new turn in American land policy, where in fact the land would not be privatized, but would be held by federal government. So we see here the constellation of very early forest reserves and national parks. Note that it does not show the other lands of the public domain out west. And of course, as we come into the progressive conservation era and Teddy Roosevelt takes the helm of the presidency, public land protection ramps up dramatically. And even through the tension between the utilitarian conservationists and preservationists, a strong focus on public land protection and management ensues. National forests, parks, monuments, early game refuges, establishment of the U.S. Fish and U.S. Forest Service, and then a bit later, the Park Service. After the aggressive public land protection efforts of the progressive era, say up to 1920, the political energy and conservation movement begins to shift toward wildlife and wildland protection. I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here, but I'll backtrack in a moment. But to make a point here that kind of the end of this arc of federal land policy comes in 1934 with passage of the Taylor Grazing Act, enacted, as it says here, after decades of rangeland deterioration, and effectively closing the western public rangelands to homesteading and ending free access to public rangelands, establishing grazing districts, and establishing the management of those lands through public agencies. Much of this, of course, was a result of the probably most significant episode of environmental deterioration in American history, the Dust Bowl. Here are the lands administered under the Taylor Grazing Act still to this day, but it really comes as a response to the crisis of the Dust Bowl in the starting in the late 1920s and through the 1930s. Images that we're familiar with when we look back on this time. So I'm going to come back to the Dust Bowl here in a little bit, but I'm going to go back briefly to pick up a couple neglected historical threads. Although these battles over protecting public lands are the stories that gain national headlines and first rank in the history books, there were in fact some key developments involving conservation on and of private lands. For example, the first land trust in 1891 in Massachusetts, or as mentioned earlier, the establishment of Adirondack Park with a key purpose of protecting the watershed for New York City. Soil conservation becomes an increasingly important theme with many expressions. George Washington Carver publishing early on the phenomenon of degraded soils. Even during the midst of the Teddy Roosevelt presidency and the focus on public lands, he also, however, instituted the Country Life Commission to pay attention to agricultural lands of settled lands and not just reserving public lands from the public. And then, of course, starting in the late 1920s, the soil conservationist and scientist Hugh Hammond Bennett publishes probably the most important early work detailing the crisis of soil erosion in 1928. Leading eventually to, and this is the last of the laws I'll mention, but the Soil Conservation Act of 1935 that set up the Soil Conservation Service. A couple key points about the work of the Soil Conservation Service become really important. First of all, this is a federal agency that owns no land. It's the only agency solely devoted to conservation on private lands. And here's an interesting little footnote. I got curious one day and did a search and found out that there's only one agency in the entire federal government that actually has the word conservation in its title, and it is what was the Soil Conservation Service, now the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Now in the upper Midwest, in my part of the country, the soil crisis involved not only wind erosion, but extreme episodes of gully erosion, highly erodible lands along the Mississippi River. And this is where Aldo Leopold enters the story. Of course, Leopold had begun his career as a manager of public lands in the Forest Service in the Southwest. But when he returned to the Midwest, he took up an abiding interest and developed expertise in private land work. He had always been interested in watersheds and had published important works in his early years in the Forest Service. But after moving back to the Midwest, to Wisconsin, the center of gravity in his works shifts, and he becomes increasingly a researcher, practitioner, and advocate of private land conservation. He took this image himself. And what he was trying to illustrate in this photo is what happens when neighboring landowners are not working together. What you're looking at here is a incipient gully and a loss of soil crossing from the property where he is standing and taking the picture, through that fence line to the neighbor's property, the gully heading straight toward the neighbor's house. And this is a key point in Leopold's development of thinking about human relationships on the land and with the land. And it's about this time that the quote that inspired this whole lecture appeared in one of Leopold's published manuscripts. The present legal and economic structures, he says, contain no suitable ready-made mechanism for protecting the public interest in private land. At a time when the public had no interest in land except to tame it. It was that phrase, the public interest in private land, that I remember reading many years ago and setting on sort of this trail of thinking that we can't simply divide public and private in the way we think about, live on, or try to take care of land. And it's with that I'm going to now shift. That was a wild ride across 150 years of American history and land policy, and I'll come back to that background scene in a bit. But let's switch gears here. I'm going to present a literal frame for visualizing the relationship between public and private land. And we'll begin with this binary that we have inherited, this hard segregation of public and private lands and interests. And using Leopold's terminology, we can think of another binary, that the mechanisms we seek to employ in conserving public and private lands fall into two main categories: governmental work and legal mechanisms, purchase, rules, regulations, taxes, etc. And then the market forces, economic mechanisms, prices, permits, subsidies, incentives, and so forth. So we can think about this now in terms of, how government, of course, is responsible for public lands because it owns it, but it also has a role to play at that intersection of private and public interest. And it's often, of course, in those areas where we find the conflicts occurring. So just to illustrate this, we can think of our public lands in all their diversity, lots of different types of public lands, not just classic conservation lands. So you can think schools and libraries, swimming pools. Some involve strict state authority, military lands, for example, or an extreme example of airports, no recreation there, rules and restrictions on those type of lands. But there's also legal and regulatory authorities on private lands. So you can think, for example, of local land use planning and zoning. You can think of restrictions on public lands as public agencies are responsible for them solely. And probably the most evident or obvious example, classic example of the conflict zone may be this. The long-standing unresolved challenge of dealing with non-point pollution, especially from agricultural lands. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act this fall, and this has always been the issue at which the Clean Water Act runs up against the public-private binary. So now we could think of, on the other side, the economic incentives and other mechanisms we use to encourage private land conservation, where these may come into conflict. So again, private lands come in many forms, from very urban to very rural. At the extreme end of this, perhaps private land exploitation and development that entails few restrictions or requirements. We have plenty of examples of that. And maybe the classic example of the conflict zone here is the long-standing tension involving public land grazing leases. For decades, it's been an important driver behind the property rights movement. So we might add our own examples or perhaps exceptions to this basic framework. But in fact, I lay it out to suggest that adhering to this frame in our understanding of conservation history locks us into a bind. So how can we play with this to consider seriously a healthier integration of public and private lands and interests? How can we look and work beyond the binary? So I start with the fact that, in fact, we've been doing so for a while, especially over the last present generation, and I'll work up to that. But let's start again with the standard binary. But in fact, there's a porous boundary between them, figuratively and quite literally. Things occur and move across the public-private boundary line. Most fundamentally, air, water, plants and animals, biodiversity, food, scenery, people. Things move across boundaries. They connect to our lands in the landscape. Ecological processes, fire, grazing, just to choose a couple examples. Processes and disturbance that determine the shape of the landscape despite the jurisdictional boundaries. And so we might see public and private interests interspersed within larger, entire landscapes. So think whole biomes, watersheds, migratory pathways, and so on, that bring together public, private, and other lands in the whole. So now let's imagine loosening that knot, deconstructing the binary. We can move from these strict binaries and understand, in fact, other systems exist, and there's perhaps a spectrum instead of a binary, a continuum between public and private, as we recognize the public interest in private land. Similarly, that binary of legal and economic mechanisms, there are other things that allow us and work in landscapes to motivate ourselves toward conservation. So we can fill out this frame here. And again, think of this not in terms of the strict binary, but in terms of a continuum. What does this do? It makes space for other lands that just don't fit, most especially indigenous lands or other forms of shared and communal ownership. It allows us to see the conflict zones as also potential zones of cooperation, collaboration, and reconciliation using all kinds of other tools, land trusts, watersheds. The very concept of ecosystem management arising in the early 1990s was an expression of this. Community-based conservation, I'll talk more about this in a bit, and other forms, even the concept of ecosystem services, that the economic benefits of different types of land accrue across the landscape. So essentially what I'm suggesting is that by deconstructing the binary, creating the continuum, complexifying the whole framework here allows us to open up the decision space in the middle of this frame, where all these diverse tools and approaches, think land trusts, think conservation easements, think memorandums of understanding, can be developed and put to use to sustain shared interest in the land. Now, if I had greater computer skills, what I would love to do is kind of add another dimension here, and that is the dimension of time. Imagine this frame moving through history to record, for example, the taking of indigenous lands over the centuries and the rematriation of some of those lands, at least at present, or the dispossession of Black farmers over the generations, or the relentless consolidation of agricultural lands in the last several decades. Think how it might illuminate the effort to address Leopold's complaint that we lack a suitable mechanism for protecting the public interest in private land. So if I'm going to just stay in this theoretical realm for just one more slide here, I think I'm going to bring in Garrett Hardin. Most of us of an age when we were in school probably read Garrett Hardin's famous work, The Tragedy of the Commons, and recall his famous statement that freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. And if we assume that individual freedom and collective well-being are inevitably at odds, they're binary, individual freedom and collective well-being, then the tragedy is real. But if we depolarize, if we begin to think of our individual and collective interests, our private and public interests as integrated, then we may better secure the common good in the land we share. And of course, the rejoinder to Hardin came from the late economist, Nobel Prize winner and theorist Elinor Ostrom, whose studies of the governance of common pool resources revealed that cultures and communities can and have evolved the means of enhancing and ensuring resilience. And they do so, I'd suggest, in that expanded decision space between the public and private. Ostrom wrote, "What's missing from the policy analyst toolkit and from the set of accepted well-developed theories of human organization is an adequately specified theory of collective action, whereby a group of principals can organize themselves voluntarily to retain the residuals of their own efforts." Those are her words. Put in simpler terms, we can think of this landscape that I started off our journey here through the binary, and think that Eleanor Ostrom might have productively examined this as a case study, the Coon Valley watershed out there in western Wisconsin. To solve the problem of watershed degradation, that is to say, to secure the public interest in the private land in that watershed, required something new in the history of conservation: coordinated action at the watershed and community level. This was the first watershed restoration project in the nation. More than 400 participating farmers, you see their lands on the left side of your screen here, participating on a voluntary basis with the assistance of that brand new agency, the Soil Conservation Service. Leopold wrote about this in one of his key articles from the 1930s, an adventure in cooperative conservation. There isn't an inch of land that is owned by the government in the Coon Valley watershed, and yet that federal agency was absolutely essential to restoring that watershed in partnership with these hundreds of farmsteads and farmstead owners. The project was special, but it wasn't unique. I could have chosen other precedents. This is Coon Valley today, as you might see it, with its characteristic conservation farming techniques on display. But the history of conservation has showed in times of crisis, things indeed can fall apart. There can be a tragedy of the commons, but things can come together and new approaches to land stewardship can emerge. So there's a whole additional chapter of this history that time won't allow me to fully explore, but I do want to at least recognize and put it on the table. And that chapter involves the fate of the public-private land binary as the conservation movement morphed into the environmental movement in the 1960s and 70s. So my shorthand way of saying this is, as the environmental movement grew, its largely urban and suburban constituency had less experience with the legacy and mechanisms of private land conservation, and devoted proportionally more of its energies to public land issues, needs, and controversies. And in that relative vacuum, the backlash property rights movement re-emerged, as it is regularly done, to assert its libertarian convictions. And for a long while, environmentalism as a movement had no response. Despite its legacy of private land conservation that it could have drawn upon, environmentalists were, and this is sometimes how I say it, environmentalists were caught with their history down. That began to change in through the 1980s and up to present due to several factors. To name a few, in agriculture, we had the farm crisis of the mid-1980s that brought new meaning and attention to concepts of sustainability, especially on private lands and agricultural working lands. And starting in 1986, the Federal Farm Bill was very important in instituting new conservation programs. In the government, especially in the state aid and federal agencies, a realization that conservation challenges and needs do not respect jurisdictional boundaries. They had to work across boundaries. In academia, new interdisciplinary fields emerged: landscape ecology, conservation biology, agroecology, restoration ecology, we could go on, to provide foundations for these new developments through greater understanding the diversity, complexity, and dynamism socio-ecological systems. In the nonprofit world, conservation groups grew to understand that perpetual conflict rarely solves problems. To solve those problems, one must work on the human relationships in the land. In short, the conservation community came to rediscover that the vital role that private lands must play to sustaining healthy, diverse, and beautiful landscapes. This was a key report from 1997 from the new natural resources, renamed Natural Resources Conservation Service. Private land, America's Private Land, a Geography of Hope. This report really brought attention back to the importance of private lands in the conservation arena. And we see all kinds of new works coming out. I don't know if my friend Rick Knight is listening in, but he was a key figure and still is a key figure in the American West and beyond in helping us imagine what stewardship across boundaries looks like. And so this work continues to the day. I could go on and give a long explanation. I know I'm getting short on time here, but work here in the American Southwest on the Borderlands, a group I've worked with for 20 plus years now. The Malpai Borderlands group, just to choose one example of so many, but the Malpai Borderlands group bringing together ranchers, environmentalists, scientists, agency officials to look at this amazing diverse landscape along the borderlands of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico. Important, and I use it in part because of that phrase, working wilderness, that perhaps 100 years ago that might have been a paradox, but in fact, working lands are now a key part, essential part, necessary part of thinking about all the issues that we face now. And you see it reflected in this recent paper that I came across that understands we need to think about how to institute and governance, as it says here, of working landscapes, as we understand the potential to help address global environmental crises such as climate change and biodiversity loss. This is actually a call to historians. This group, I think, has a call, and this paper is making a call to us to help us understand, as it says here in the second part of the quote, understand the ownership of working lands, the rules that control their use, how the rules were made and enforced. That is a job for historians to help us understand, and maybe this talk can be a stimulus to some of that. So I'll sum up here. Here's my talk in a nutshell. Efforts to conserve land and confront historic inequities and addressing those legacies are constrained by the assumed strict dualism of public and private land and interest. An alternate frame can provide opportunities to reinterpret conservation history, integrate those interests, and expand the decision space. By moving from a simple binary framing to recognize a continuum of public and private interests, while also honoring interests beyond the human, the non-human beings we share this place on Earth with, allows us to embrace a wider array of approaches to conserving the, quote, public interest in private land. And that has important implications for addressing historic wrongs and honoring responsibilities to our human and natural communities and to future generations. So I promised at the beginning that I'd come back to this slide, and I'm going to let my colleague from the Ho-Chunk Nation give us the last word. I asked Randy why he designed this sign in this way at Ma-Wakanchunk, the sacred earth lands of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And here's what he wrote to me in an email the other day. He's the land manager for the Ho-Chunk Nation, and I will give him the last word. He says, I chose the language on this sign to clarify that the tribal lands are closed to the public at this time and soften the language compared to the standard no trespassing. You may recall that our land division had originally marched out and posted the boundary with the obtrusive yellow no trespassing signs from the hardware store. I found that to be counter to our long-term goals of collaborative restoration and education. So I hope I am within my time constraints here, and I hope we have some questions that I can field. And thank you all again for participating. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm terribly grateful to see 120 participants at the noted at the bottom of my screen.
Thanks, Curt. Let you get a drink there. That is a lot of food for thought. So we're going to go to see what we have in the questions. Just a reminder that please post your questions in the Q&A forum, not in the chat. And so we'll start with Mary Watkins. She says corporate large agribusiness like TIAA's buy-up of Mississippi Delta land displace small farmers and make it extremely difficult for people of color and women to begin or sustain small farms. How might you approach consultation with an investor firm like TIAA to understand how best to support reforestation, small farmers, and yet still deliver some profitability to its stockholders?
Wow, that is a complex and important question. I know a little bit about that situation, but only from what I've read in a few accounts and newspapers and such. But if I can frame it, I would say, it's a question about how do this emerging class of corporate landowners, especially of productive agricultural land in the US, how do we try to even address our issues when those forces, which are international in scope and which are well leveraged, how do we get them to care about these conservation related issues and the issues of the legacies of injustice? Well, for this audience, I guess I should first start by saying that they have to learn the history. They have to learn the history of our lands and allow those questions to penetrate these kind of discussions. There have to be some new mechanisms, to again use Leopold's word, for allowing those stories to be told, for those voices to be heard, for those legacies to be acknowledged, and for creative, hopefully, answers that might involve such shifts in tenure. So, I have a lot of things in my own mind when I say that the kind of work that I've been able to do locally in my own landscape, where take that last slide of working with the Ho-Chunk Nation, it took us years and years and years of quiet one-on-one work, quiet building of relationships to understand how we might begin to move towards some form of reconciliation. So I don't know if that's an adequate answer to your question, but I think it's an instinct for all of us on this call today to say it starts with knowing the history, knowing the stories of the land and the people of that place. Because if we don't do that first step, we may never get to the next steps we need to take.
Okay. Charles McClure asks, can we use your non-binary model to educate the public in the realm of politics and political parties? So this is sounds a little bit like it's a multifaceted. This is a nice complement to the previous question.
Yeah, and especially as I was focused on pulling this lecture together in this new form, with the election just last week, that question was on my mind a lot. I'll tell you one direction it went. As many of you probably know, there's been a lot of discussion about the playing out of political divisions at the local level through school boards. And so, we could map onto what I presented today, map it onto local public schools versus private schools, just to choose that as one expression of this. The debates over what private schools and public schools supported with tax dollars, public dollars, how this kind of getting past this binary again. I know, having read a little bit about this, those who are discontent with public schools have taken to calling them government schools. Just that change in verbiage brings, of course, baggage, and that's the intent. So it comes down to, again, the forces of division at work in our political culture. What my friend Courtney White, who is a key part of this whole presentation I just gave you, founder of the Quivira Coalition in New Mexico, Courtney used to talk about this as an expression of the conflict industry. Thinking back on those conflict zones in my little graphic, those who exist to exploit those conflicts. There is an entire industry built around that to, in fact, create the conflict. And so we not only have the division, we have the forces of division to contend with that are quite powerful. And so I haven't thought through enough of how we can map, again, this onto other expressions of the public and private tension in our different realms of public life and private life. But perhaps there's some hints here that can help us think through that.
Georgia Peterson asks, conventional values in the US typically go like this: it's my property and I can do what I want with it. So the question is, what might be some good ways to reframe general attitudes towards a more long-term conservation-minded caretaker perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to default here and recommend a book. It's the book that really helped me think through that question. I'm thinking of Eric Freifogel's, many of his, almost all of his books address these issues. He's a retired law professor now at the University of Illinois, and I think of him as the preeminent scholar of private property and public responsibilities, especially drawing a deep background in conservation law and property law. He wrote the book, I showed a photo of it, called The Land We Share. I think of that book very fondly. I made the joke in my talk about environmentalists being caught with their history down when it came to understanding the history of property and private conservation work. That book was the response for me. It was the book coming out in, I think, the late 90s that helped, or maybe early 2000s, that helped me to work through that, recognizing that property law is not this absolute, what I own, I can do whatever I want with sort of notion, this mythology we've grown up with, that in fact, private property is a creation of the government. It's a creation of the public sector. It's an institution. And that institution is subject to not only the laws, but to the cultural and social mores that we develop. The ethic, as Aldo Leopold called it, of course. In the interest of not messing up what Eric, how he would answer that question, I really recommend that book, The Land We Share, among many others, but that's the one I always recommend to folks with that question.
So given Ralph Lutz's question about how do we promote, in the words of Joseph Wood Crutch, a we are all in this together mentality, is this a book that addresses that? And do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, or the other saying that comes to mind is we all do better when we all do better. Yeah, how do we get out of this jam, this bind, is the word I used in the talk, of thinking of ourselves as set apart from one another in our public and private identities? It plays out on the landscape visibly and loudly, of course, in the conservation arena, but it's also pertinent in all walks of our lives. Think of the pandemic, the difference between public health and private health, if you want to use that term, and responsibilities we share. So I think I lost the thread of the question here, but yeah, these scholarly works, his was only one, and of course I'm happy to share those references, and there's many others with you, Jamie, and to share them with listeners here. But they have certainly helped me to get to this point of thinking about how simplistic notions of private property, we have done a very poor job of educating ourselves, both in terms of the legality of property as an institution, but also in terms of the way it affects our ability to collaborate on the landscape. So I do, yeah, those books are extremely helpful.
Well, that Mark Harvey, who is an environmental historian, asks if you could suggest a list of books or articles. So I'm going to ask a favor of you. Instead of, if you want to name a couple off the top of your head right now, that's fine. But maybe if you could generate if you will, a reading list that we can then provide to our attendees and we'll have on the website, that would be extremely helpful. But it does have, there are books that look at things on a national scale. And then, as Mark is suggesting, books on, say, the Coon Valley Restoration Project or other local issues. I do know, or I'm recalling, that there some of the best progress in terms of cooperation on the land comes at the very local level. And so I'm wondering if you have a few other examples of that in the context of your non-binary model.
Yeah. I mean, in the conservation arena, that portion of the talk alluded to, we've seen this movement, and it is a movement within a movement toward community-based approaches. And I think of it as dating, well, all the way back to at least Leopold's work at Coon Valley, and there are many other predecessor examples, but that's the one I know best. But then we really see, starting in the 90s, the movement both internationally and in the US, and it has different resonance overseas than it does here, I should say that too. But at least in the US, the burgeoning of community-based organizations all across the country in so many different circumstances with so many different arrays of stakeholders involved. And it's not just in rural lands, it's in urban lands and across the landscape. I noted at the end the Malpai Borderlands group because it was a especially significant early one in breaking down that tension between ranchers and conservationists in the American West. But there are now, for example, cattlemen's land trusts, I think in almost every state in the American West. None of them existed 25 years ago. I think Colorado's was the first, and then every other state in the West. So cattlemen's land trust, that almost would have been an oxymoron 30 years ago. I left out from my talk, I was going to end it, I knew I was getting short on time, a little reference to the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge by the libertarian forces under the leadership of the Bundy clan. Most of you remember that episode, and yet it faltered, right? It did not succeed because they went expecting that the rural landowners of that part of Oregon would rise up in support and solidarity, and they did not. And the reason was that the Fish and Wildlife Service and many other partners, including the tribal communities of the area, had come together over years to talk over collaborative work, and it sort of inoculated that landscape from this type of divisiveness. And so the uprising failed. And there's a real lesson in that for all of us, that people, when they are given the opportunity and the tools to engage in this kind of collaborative, constructive, very local discussion, can in fact overcome those forces of division.
I think some of it's just getting people to sit and listen.
Scarcest commodity we have these days, right?
Yeah.
Time to listen.
Come in with your defense shields down and a willingness to listen. That seems to be when these projects are able to move forward.
Yeah, I highlighted another book in my talk, and for those of you, especially in the West, I'd recommend it highly. It's Gary Nabhan's co-edited book called Stitching the West Back Together. Stitching the West Back Together. It's a really fine edited volume of commentaries on the movement toward what my colleagues have taken to calling the radical center in the West, to bringing people together in the place where we can stay apart from those who want to engage in the conflict to the end of time, versus those who want to come together and find solutions, which is the real definition, in my view, of leadership in conservation.
Yeah, and part of this is learning to block out the rhetoric from those who profit from continued division. Linda Hardison asks, how does the acquisition of agricultural lands by foreign entities play into this conversation?
Ooh, you know, you can make a whole career studying that question, and I have colleagues who know the ins and outs and details much better than I do, but it is definitely going to be an issue more and more in the near future. In fact, just yesterday I was reading a story about agricultural land prices, I think it was in the Dakotas, at all-time highs. Land is now looked upon as a safe investment and a profitable investment. It's looked upon as a much more durable asset than so many of the other pools of wealth that we like to consider. So what does that mean? It means that the owner of the land is not the person who works on, lives on the land. It's not part of the local community. It doesn't bear any of this history. It doesn't concern itself with addressing the inequities of that history, much less the opportunities for the future. It looks to make a profit. Now, that's not to say that's not amenable to other, let's call them progressive solutions. And so that trend is going to intersect, as it is already, with trends toward more regenerative forms of agriculture. Big players in the international agriculture and food world are now putting a lot of time, effort, and money, at least on paper and in headlines, to promoting more sustainable or regenerative forms of agriculture. And if we ever put a price on carbon, boy, that market will go nuts, because we're going to have to, within the next 10 years, figure out how to get as much carbon back into the soil and into the plants on the soil as we can. It's a crisis. It's a slower moving crisis than the Dust Bowl, perhaps. But so I'm not answering the question very well, but it is going to provide both opportunities and constraints. This international investment of large financial entities in land.
Okay. Brady Dyer, I'm going to give a little, this is, there's some background here leading up to the question. The death of the commons in England was enabled by the Enclosure Acts, which marked the transition from feudalism to capitalist economy and removed the peasantry, or kicked the peasantry off the land. Can you make more explicit the role of capitalist ideology in the development of the rift between public and private interests?
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for bringing the historical reference of the enclosures. I actually did have that in my notes, but again, I had to confine myself. Well, I think looking back on what I shared with you all, that probably the clearest way to answer that question is to say, think of the epic, and probably poorly appreciated impact of the commodification of land that was instituted at the outset of the United States as a nation through the Public Land Survey. The Public Land Survey had one main purpose. It was to convert what had been the public domain into a commodity that could be bought and sold. It capitalized the land. And it made it possible, as our colleague Bill Cronin has, I remember him saying this, it allowed someone sitting in an office in Philadelphia to look at the description of the land in the Dakota Territory and purchase it without ever having seen it. So we're only beginning to reckon with the centuries-old legacy of the commodification of land just in North America, apart from the global scope of this question. And often these critiques of not only capitalism, but of all human economic systems, because none of them has fully taken into account ecological wisdom, much less traditional ecological wisdom. How are we to then navigate through all of this with all those other trends that we've also talked about of corporate corporate investment and consolidation of agricultural entities and such? This is framing the crisis we have in front of us. We are going to have to be deconstructing the capitalist ethos. This was what Aldo Leopold's task was, if you think about it. In his opening of Sand County Almanac, we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community belonging to us, to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So we are seeing now, I think, the rumblings of this. We're beginning to understand that this system has created the problems we're facing and that are so complex and interwoven that we have to go to the roots of this. And the roots are our relationship to land. Ecological, physical, spiritual, economic. And this is what the greatest thinkers and writers in our conservation legacy have helped us to get to, everyone from Thoreau to Robin Wall Kimmerer. at present, helping us to think through the ethical dimensions of our land relationships that can help us constrain the economic forces.
Well, coincidentally, Caroline Torkeldsen offers up a comment, which is we can learn from other countries. The cultural lessons that are being had to start thinking, how do things affect us as a group, as a people? She said we can learn from other countries and from native tribes who know this as well. We need to relearn what was lost. And in fact, she recommends Robin Kimmel's braiding switchgrass.
Sweetgrass.
Sorry. Well, yes, you're correct.
Yeah.
She had jotted it down incorrectly, but it is sweetgrass. And so we'll add that to the reading list.
Oh yeah, that should be on everyone's reading list.
In fact, I'd like to thank Alice Ingerson for popping that title, the full title and the publication information into the Q&A. So that full title is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants.
Yeah, I couldn't recommend it. Robin is an old colleague of mine and friend, and I'm thrilled to see she was also recently named a MacArthur Genius. We should mention that. But if I could build on that point, I think it's not just Robin's work. I shouldn't say that. It's Robin's work and so much more. And she would be the first to say that. The reclaiming of Native knowledge and the reclaiming of interest, and how appropriate, Native American Month we're in the middle of, right? Is a reflection, I think, of what I tried to share today, that as we're trying to deal with the fundamental roots of our conservation needs and the crises, multiple crises we face, we are looking for all sources of wisdom because we're going to need them to get us through the crises we face. And so the revival and reclamation of Native understanding and ways of knowing has become an expression of this. And there is a very, very important and intense discussion, I think, happening in the conservation arena about that intersection of Western and non-Western traditions in conservation. And again, I will bow my head in appreciation to the Environmental History Working Group that has taken on that theme a lot in its discussions over the last year and a half, and I really appreciate them helping stimulate it.
We have a question. What opinion might you have about the America the Beautiful initiative and the related goal to conserve 30% land by 2030 as it relates to private and public lands? And can the initiative and national goal inspire a nationwide ethic for landscape stewardship?
Thanks. Great question. I'll say at the start that I'm aware of the initiative, but I've never taken time to study the details. And again, as a conservation biologist person, I want to dig into the details of what's proposed and where the money is supposed to go and all that. But I'll say this, that's a great example of how the binary shapes the way a proposal initiative like this is received. I'm well aware of people in the political arena have already, they see the headline, President Biden proposes 30 by 30, and all of a sudden it's a talking point. It goes from that proposal, that initiative, to being a talking point in a microsecond. Because it's another, quote, land grab. It's, again, the federal government taking over your land. It's falling into the trap that the libertarian approach loves to set. That said, I know that within the initiative, there are ways of thinking. It's not just setting, 30% of this land base behind a fortress boundary. That, in fact, at least in some of the commentaries I've read and some of the discussions, that, in fact, it is asking, how can we include not only the classic public land set aside places, but private land as well. And so I can't give you a very good detailed answer because I just don't know enough about the inner workings of the initiative. But be aware, be thoughtful. I think this, as the plan goes forward, watch for how players again invoke the binary. for political purposes, especially. And let's watch to see what the environmental and conservation response is to that. Let's to see, you know, can we diffuse the binary? Can we walk back from that conflict zone and just not join it, just not participate in it? Say, you know, another great example of this, some of you may know about, is the American Prairie Preserve up in Montana. Another case, you could do a whole lecture on this amazing proposal to create a vast area of restored prairie land in eastern Montana. And it's falling into the same kind of, again, let's fall back into the binary. I don't like public land, or I don't like private land. I don't like ranchers. I don't like government officials, et cetera, et cetera. It's all kabuki theater. You know, sometimes it just seems that way. It's like, okay, what's the role are you going to play? Who am I supposed to be in this game? Instead of us coming together and quietly diffusing that, as the Malheur example provides a case study for.
It seems like this is, well, almost intractable, and yet there are these examples that give us hope and cause for optimism. And so I myself am now kind of stuck in that, if you will, that conflict zone of of exactly that, where we're it's, well, I mean, this is true of just so many conversations in a political arena that we can't have, because people don't want to listen, but they also don't want to, it's a zero-sum game. So I guess maybe my question is, how do we get out of that framework? Does this go back to what you were saying of it starts with education and understanding the history, or
well, it may even go deeper.
I'm putting you on the spot, and
Sorry,
Curt, could you solve the world's problems here in the next?
We're out of time. I'm looking at my clock here.
Hard stop.
Well, here, I'll tell you the way I put it once. Well, yeah, education is always necessary. Understanding the history, understanding the legacies, understanding the different perspectives and viewpoints and where they come from, all of that. The more knowledge, the better. But we also know that all the information and data in the world doesn't change people's minds when it comes to, we're becoming increasingly aware of this. It's a matter of the stories we tell and the connections we make and the relationships we build. In conservation, that's just, to me, an iron rule. It's all about relationships. And so I've taken to saying, you know, I'm going to lead with the heart on these conversations, which is to say, we have to restore not only the lands and waters, we have to restore our humanity in the process. That might seem a little abstract and even utopian, but we're in a crisis that is a reflection of these legacies from our history. And they are multiple intersecting crises now, and we're facing rates and scales and types of change we've never experienced as a species before, much less as modern humans facing current realities. So the ability to step back, to try to understand where those other, quote, others are coming from, and then to try to find the common ground. And that's why this work is so frustrating and yet so exciting in conservation, is because when you find the common ground, anything can happen. And you know, we who work in conservation, we all have our stories of the disasters as well as the amazing, unexpected, sometimes leaps forward that we've been able to make. I ended my presentation with that photo from a landscape. I'm pointing to it. It's about 10 miles that way where I'm sitting right now. And I've been involved there not only in my professional capacity, but in my capacity as a resident of this community. And that's the hat you wear most in these conversations. You're there because you live in the place. And so it's returning to place in this work and in our attempts to deal with these conflicts. Because the conflicts, as I also said in the talk, are also points of creative consensus building. but we have to change the chemistry of them. And that calls for other skills and parts of our brain and the heart that we're not trained in our formal science and humanities scholarship necessarily to understand how to tap into. And so we need the arts, and we need the wisdom of faith traditions. We need ways of understanding and knowing, and again, why traditional knowledge has come back to enter into this conversation. So importantly, it helps us to get through these binds and to connect with our common humanity. I feel like I'm kind of just blathering on at this point, but it's exciting work when again you get to see it. It's been the greatest honor in my career to work with neighbors in the Ho-Chunk Nation in this case, and to not, to claim much. I'm just another ally to their work, but to learn through that process and to listen, as you said, to sit and listen, and to how that then deepens the way we think about these complex legacies. I know I could not have given this presentation today if it weren't for 25 years of work with my Ho-Chunk neighbors in this place. So I'll leave it at that, because I could go on and don't know if I'm making any sense anymore.
But you are, and I mean, it really is. I like what you said, though, the leading with your heart, which ancillary to that, or it's also leading with your heart, but listening with your ears. And I think that's really what it takes, is sitting down and listening to what the other person's position is, not interrupting them when they're doing so, giving them the space to do so. I think people will learn that it does diffuse the problem. If a person, oftentimes these conflicts are a result of a person or a group feeling like they haven't been heard, or no one is listening to them. And I think it starts with that. So it's listening and letting them feel that they have been heard. And then that may turn the temperature down on the water some.
Yeah. Yeah.
But starting locally and building from there. To turn a phrase, it's going to be grassroots movements that make the difference. So I think with that, we'll end on that optimistic note.